For a long time, I measured my life against Daniel's. Not consciously, not with any deliberate intention, the way you don't notice you're tilting toward a window until you realize the light is already on your face. Daniel was my older brother by 3 years, and the comparison was so structurally embedded in how our family worked that I had absorbed it before I had the vocabulary to name what I was absorbing. He was the one who got the grades without appearing to try. He was the one who made adults in the room subtly realign their attention. He was the one who, when he walked into a room that contained both of us, made me feel like I had just become slightly less visible. I want to be careful here, because this is not a story about Daniel doing something wrong. He was kind to me, genuinely, in the easy way of someone who has never needed to defend their position. The cruelty was not in him. It was in the comparison itself, in the invisible ruler I had pressed against both our lives since I was old enough to know what a ruler was for. By the time I was in my late 20s, Daniel had a career that made sense from the outside, a relationship that looked stable, an apartment in the city that suggested forward momentum. He had, in the language people use approvingly, figured it out. What I had was something more provisional. A job that I was competent at without caring much about. A series of relationships that I would describe, if I am being honest, as comfortable in the way that avoiding something is comfortable. A life that, on the surface, was not obviously wrong but that felt, from the inside, like something I was managing rather than living. What I did not see, what I was genuinely unable to see for most of that decade, was that I had organized my sense of self almost entirely around the distance between Daniel's life and mine. Not around what I actually wanted. Not around what would have happened if I had pointed myself toward my own desires without any reference to him at all. My life had become, in a structural and invisible way, a response to Daniel's life. A commentary on it. And comments are not independent things. A comment requires the original text. I had spent years writing in the margins of someone else's page and calling it my own work. The moment I begin to actually see this is at a family dinner in November, the kind of dinner where everyone sits around a table that is too small and performs a version of family that is slightly elevated above the daily version. Daniel had just been promoted. The promotion was real and deserved. My parents were happy in the uncomplicated way that parents are happy when a child does something legible and good. And I sat at that table and felt something I had felt many times before, a tightening, a contraction, a specific quality of diminishment, but this time, instead of routing it into the familiar channels of quiet resentment and private self-criticism, I paused and tried to look at it directly. What was the feeling, exactly? Not hatred of Daniel. What I felt, traced carefully, was something closer to panic, not about his promotion specifically, but about the gap. The felt sense that the distance between where he was and where I was had just increased, and that this increase was evidence of something, was a verdict on me. That was the word I needed, verdict. I had been using Daniel's life as a court in which mine was perpetually on trial. I drove home that night and sat in my car in the dark and tried to follow that thread somewhere useful. If his life was the court, what was the charge? What exactly was I being found guilty of, and by whom? When I sat with it long enough, the answer was, I didn't know. I could not say, in any concrete terms, what Daniel having a good life meant about mine. The comparison was producing verdicts without any coherent legal basis. And yet the verdicts had been running my life for a decade. What I had not asked myself, what the comparison had actively prevented me from asking, was what I would want if Daniel didn't exist. Not as a hypothetical cruelty, but as a genuine question. If I removed the reference point entirely, what would I be moving toward? What did I actually want? I realized, sitting in that parking lot, that I had never seriously asked it. My choices over the previous decade had been made in response to something rather than in pursuit of something. I had chosen my job because it was respectable enough to show adequately at the family table. I had chosen a city where Daniel did not live, creating an illusion of independence while preserving the reference point. Even my quieter choices, the things I bothered to become competent at, the person I tried to present as myself, were made with an awareness of the comparison, either to close the gap or reframe the terms of the competition. I was not living a life. I was arguing a case. The change did not come all at once. What came first was a different quality of attention, a new habit of asking, when I made a decision or felt a feeling, whether Daniel was in the room. Not literally, but as the invisible other end of the ruler. And what I found, once I started looking, was that he was in more rooms than I had realized. The comparison had colonized spaces I had thought were entirely my own. I started to see, for instance, that my dissatisfaction with my job was not really about the job. The job was fine, genuinely, for what it was. What it was not was impressive in the specific register that the comparison required. It would not produce the right sentence at a family dinner, could not close the gap. And so I had been experiencing it as insufficient when what it actually was, stripped of the comparison, was a reasonably decent way to spend a working day. The job hadn't changed. The frame had. I started to see that the relationship I was in, careful, comfortable, slightly at arm's length, was partly constructed to keep me from needing too much, because needing too much would make the insufficiency more visible. The low-level flatness I had diagnosed as adult maturity was, more accurately, a strategy for managing grief about a comparison I had never examined. What followed was most of a year of quiet, unglamorous work, noticing when the comparison appeared, asking what it was doing there, and practicing the difficult exercise of setting it aside and asking the question underneath. Not what does this mean relative to Daniel, but what do I actually want here? What would I choose if the choice were only about me? That question, practiced consistently, started to produce different answers. Modest, specific answers. That I wanted a different kind of work. That I wanted more from a relationship than I had been allowing myself to ask for. That desire, uncontaminated by comparison, turns out to be a workable navigational tool. The last conversation I had about this with Daniel, and it was not, from his side, a conversation about comparison at all, because he had never known that comparison was happening, was at the same table, a different year, a different November. He asked what I was working on. And I told him the real thing, not the respectable version. He said, "That sounds like you." He meant it as a friendly observation. But it landed differently. It was the first time in years someone had used the word "you" about my life in a way that meant something specific and individual, not you in relation to anyone else, just you, doing the thing that fits that particular person. I had spent years trying to become a better answer to a question someone else was living. The gap between my life and Daniel said nothing about either of our lives independently. It was only information about the distance between two trajectories that had never needed to be compared, two separate lives pressed together by family mechanics and my own unconscious participation until the relationship between them felt like the most important fact about me. It wasn't. It had never been. The most important fact about me was what I wanted when I stopped looking sideways. That turned out to be enough to build from. Something, for the first time, that felt actually mine. Here is what I carry forward from this, and what I hope might be useful if you recognize any part of your own story in mine. The pattern I described does not operate because we are careless or unintelligent or unaware. It operates because it has a function, because it is doing something for us that we have not found another way to do. Staying in the wrong situation, staying silent when we should speak, not walking away when the door is right there, all of these behaviors persist because they are solving something, even if imperfectly. They are providing some version of comfort or protection or identity that we have not yet found a better way to provide. Understanding that function is the first move. Not judging the behavior, but asking honestly, what is this doing for me? What would I have to give up if I stopped? What am I afraid will happen if I make the change I know I need to make? Those questions do not dissolve the pattern automatically. But they make it visible in a new way. And visibility changes the relationship to the thing. When you can see what something is doing, you can start to choose whether you want it to keep doing it. The change that followed was not easier because I understood the mechanism. It was the same difficulty. But I went into it knowing what I was moving through rather than being entirely inside it without perspective. That perspective is what I want to pass on here. Not the specific story. The structure. The shape of how we stay in things longer than we should, how we look away from things we can see, how we tell ourselves the thing will change without giving it a mechanism for changing. You are not alone in this. It is not a character flaw. It is how the human nervous system manages uncertainty and fear. But you can do something different. The doing starts with the looking. Look at it. Directly. Honestly. Without the story that makes it easier to carry. And then decide what you want to do with what you see. That decision, fully conscious and fully yours, is the only kind that actually changes anything. There is also something I want to say about the specific moment of turning toward rather than away, the moment when you actually do the thing you have been not doing. Because that moment has a texture that I was not prepared for, and that I think is worth naming so you know what to expect when you reach it. It does not feel like relief. Not at first. The moment of change, of finally having the conversation, or walking away, or saying the thing, or making the decision, often feels worse before it feels better. There is a period of acute discomfort in which the old equilibrium has been disturbed but the new one has not yet settled. You have stopped managing the avoidance, which means the thing you were avoiding is now fully present, no longer softened by distance. That period is real and it is temporary. I want to say both of those things with equal emphasis. It is real. Do not be surprised by it, do not mistake it for evidence that you made the wrong choice. And it is temporary, it has a duration, and that duration is almost always shorter than the years of management that preceded it. The other side of that period is different. Not perfect, change does not produce perfection. But different in the specific way of someone who has stopped spending energy on maintaining something and can now spend that energy somewhere else. The ambient cost disappears. The weight that you had normalized as simply the weight of life turns out to have been specific and removable. I have felt that release more than once. Each time it is instructive about how much I had been carrying that I didn't know I was carrying. You probably know what you're carrying. You just haven't decided to put it down yet. When you decide, it will be hard first and better after. That is almost always the order of things. And the better, when it arrives, is real. What I notice now, in the life I have after the story I told here, is a kind of attentiveness I didn't have before. Not anxiety, that's different. Anxiety is looking for the thing that might go wrong. What I have is more like a quiet, ongoing check-in. Am I here because I want to be? Am I saying what I actually think? Am I moving toward what matters or managing around something I haven't named? These questions don't produce constant disruption. Most of the time the answer is, yes, I am where I want to be, saying what I think, moving in the right direction. The check-in confirms what I thought. And that confirmation is itself valuable. It builds a different relationship with my own choices. They feel more like choices and less like things happening to me. On the occasions when the answer is different, when the check-in reveals an avoidance or a suppression or a staying too long, I try to act on the information faster than I used to. Not immediately, not impulsively. But without the elaborate deferral structure. Without the "I'll address this when the conditions are better." The conditions will not be better. They will be different. Different is workable. Better is a fiction. I am the only condition that changes. And I change through the practice of looking and then acting on what I see. That's the whole thing. The looking and the acting. Over and over. For as long as it takes. Which is your whole life. But a whole life spent actually inside it is worth more than a whole life spent at the edge of it, managing the view. I know which one I want. I think you do too.